I'd like to begin by acknowledging the first Australians on whose land we live and whose cultures are amongst the oldest enduring cultures in human history. As I said, this is the fourth of the Vice-Chancellor's public lecture series. In November, within 6 months' time, we'll be delivering the last lectures in the series when Professor Don Rothwell, the Assistant Head of School at the ANU College of Law, will be making that presentation. And so for any of you who would like to come along, I'd certainly encourage you to do that. So far this year, a number of leading ANU academics have delivered topical and engaging public lectures under the Vice-Chancellor's Public Lecture Series banner. If you look at those, you can see them on the ANU YouTube channel. And in fact, tonight's presentation will also videotape. I'm delighted that Professor Steve Dover, the Director of the Better School of Environment and Society, is delivering tonight's lecture. Recently, Professor Dover was named as a Public Policy Fellow in recognition of his significant contribution to public policy here at ANU, and indeed the leadership role he provides nationally. Fellows have been selected for their contribution to the areas diverse as environment, health, finance and economics, defence, Indigenous affairs, population and international law. Professor Dover is also an honorary professorial fellow at Charles Darwin University, co-convener of the ANU-based National Institute for Rural and Regional Australia, and a member of the State of Australian Cities Research Network. He plays a leading role in public debate on critical environment and sustainability issues. This evening, Professor Dover will discuss how we can learn from Australia's environment to better inform politics, politicians and public policy. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Steve Dover.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you everyone for turning up. The people I know and the people who I don't know yet. The people I know worry me more. Australia's environment is characterised by a great deal of variability across space and time. And Australia's plants and animals have adapted very well to that in ways that exhibit persistence, intimate knowledge of their operating environment, careful marshalling of resources and long-term strategies. These are attributes that many people would not ascribe to Australian politics and public policy, and that policy might learn from these to reverse what I think is a state of decay, characterised by weak evidence and use of information, infantile antagonism and myopia. So I have two themes to this tonight. The first is to suggest that Australian politics and policy might learn from Australia's environment and biota in a perhaps awkward search for an analogue, as we have an apparent struggle to comprehend the complex world we live in. That theme's actually less important, and it's more an artifice for presentation and an excuse to put some pictures up. The second theme and more important idea is to prompt us to move from just complaining about the dismal state of policy debate in this country to thinking about what we might do about it. So first I'll revisit white encounters with the Australian environment and draw out some core attributes of that environment and the plants and animals that inhabit it. And using that as a base, I'll then explore features of today's politics and public policy and put forward some indicative reforms. The Europeans who occupied Australia's environment from 1788 encountered incomprehensible noise. They struggled to understand the setting into which they had been propelled and out into which they propelled themselves. Seeking an inland sea, Sturt in 1829 found the waters of the Darling too salty to drink. The next year, at the confluence of the Murray downstream, he recorded, "The waters, though sweet, as in fresh, were turbid and had a taste of vegetable decay and a slight tinge of green. Welcome to Australia, Englishmen." Disappointment followed hope, confusion was common and incomprehension constant. Animals with pouches that hopped, animals with bills, birds the wrong colour, hard twisted trees that shed their leaves in summer, rivers that dwindled into nothing rather than getting bigger, and rainfall that defied European understanding of regularity. Many early impressions were a product of the year. Wondrous pasture one season, desolation the next in a drought. And those sorts of fluctuations still drive us. Water policy activity in Australia for decades has correlated tightly with El Niño, We rush policy change when it's dry and we forget to implement it when it rains. We fret about bushfire management during long hot spells, forgetting flood policy until La Nina returns and the rains come back. In the 1990s, I described this as policy ad hocery and amnesia. The current reforms of the National Water Initiative from 2004 to 2014 break that pattern as an attempted long-term and comprehensive approach, and it shows how long it takes to build the understanding needed and to achieve real policy reform in a complex setting. The Murray River was first properly discussed as an intergovernmental issue in Corowa in 1902. The whole Murray-Darling Basin was first appreciated administratively and policy-wise in the mid-1980s. Policy reforms seriously entertained only in the 1990s, and a coherent set of reforms proposed in 2004. 112 years. Just be patient. But the Australian continent and flora and fauna that inhabited it were undecipherable noise for a long time. Too variable, too strange, too inconsistent in form and function. It took decades and centuries to gain a workable understanding of Australian hydrology, Australian ecosystems and biota. And that is still a project under construction. And if we made mistakes in the past, was there any wonder? So on the screen is Joe Powell in his classic History of Environmental Management said of colonial Australia, its inhabitants were required to participate in a new era of Western progress long before they had time to achieve more than a rudimentary grasp of the continent's most crucial characteristics. And in Eric Rolls' famous lecture delivered on this campus in 1984, it was beyond human achievement to assess this land correctly. It was more a new planet than a new continent. I believe that if a team of modern scientists with 200 years of new knowledge were presented with Australia as it was in 1788, they would make almost as many mistakes. It was indeed more a new planet than a new continent, and we're still discovering and learning. And I hope we're getting better at not laying blame or sneering at the past for making mistakes, because we're still making mistakes, and our excuses are a lot thinner, given our greater knowledge and capacity. And as the late Peter Cullen put it, could we please at least make some new mistakes? Trial and error and unintended consequence went well beyond the colonial era and the 19th century. The subclover and superphosphate revolution in post-war agriculture was a production and soil conservation miracle. We didn't know that soil acidification would be a consequence, and we can hardly sneer at those in the 40s and 50s when we're firmly ignoring that issue in Australia now. But over time, incomprehension amidst the strange noise has been replaced by understanding and increasingly a sense of fascination and wonder. From the noise emerged some pattern and logic, very different to Europe, sometimes counterintuitive, but slowly dawning on us as very and beautifully Australian. The Australian environment and biota are indeed special and different, and they have attributes that must be appreciated if we are to live successfully on this continent. Usually we think of that in terms of natural resource management, seeking approaches suited to Australian conditions in water management or urban planning, in agriculture and so on. My play with biomimicry for public policy goes further, and perhaps too far, to ask whether the attributes of Australia's environment and biota can offer clues for a better policy and public policy, politics and public policy, more suited to being constructive and doing well in a varied, changing and complex world. So consider some images, I think if I push this it'll work, of Australia's environment. Ecologically, Australia is wonderfully diverse, shown top right in 89 ecological regions. That's the coarse summary scale. Australia's climate is variable and changes over time. Top left shows the changes in seasonality of Canberra's rainfall since 1940. That's real change. And if you wondered what had happened to the autumn break, there it is. River flows are similarly variable, summed up bottom left in the Murray-Darling Basin inflows over time. Variability beyond European comprehension. And we still argue in water allocation debates over the impossible notions of security and certainty. Bottom right is Tyndale's famous map of Indigenous peoples. There are very many of them. Now, only recently, in a flash of unusual insight, public commentary in Australia discovered a two-speed economy. Then, in a major intellectual leap, this was revised to a patchwork economy, but assuming that, ill-defined and largely assuming that state borders suffice to explain variation in economic and social condition. But the reality is obvious. Australia is an environment and an economy and a society that varies at fine scale and changes over time. And unless we have the wit to know that and understand the dynamic of it, our actions will not suit where we live. We're only beginning to understand at what a fine scale and in how many different ways the first peoples of Australia managed this environment. And in this marvellously varied environment, plants and animals exhibit some really very sensible characteristics. Australian plants are said to be fire adapted, but they're adapted in different ways. Our plants understand fire. Top left, after the Canberra fires of 2003, peppermints in the background regenerated strongly from epicomic buds, but very little from seed. In the foreground, only a few metres away, alpine ash were killed, but regenerated from seed, just across a few metres. And Jeff, I hope I got the species right. I find a lot more evidence of a clever country in the epicomic buds and lignotubers of our plants than I do in current innovation policy or research funding policy. Recent advantages in water efficiency in Australia are a late, incomplete copy of the abstemious habits of our own trees. Red kangaroos travel vast distances in sync with rain and resource abundance and manage their reproduction in an exactly Australian way. Birds like the budgerigar marshal reserves and travel great distances in accord with a varied environment. And when things get too dry, the burrowing frog and shield shrimp just shut down and wait for rain. People talk of El Nino species as particular ones adapted to high variability, but the bulk of our species understand variability and manage their affairs to suit a complex environment. Our plants and animals know and read signals from their surroundings incredibly well, better than we do. So from those sorts of examples, we can propose some essential attributes of living in a complex, changing, interconnected world. First, understand the world is variable across space and time, and above all, value information about that variability. Second, be patient for results and don't seek to maximise near-term returns at the expense of long-term strategy. Third, keep reserves and manage resources over time. And fourth, celebrate and rely on diversity and collaboration. As we've gained understanding, we've reduced the noise and the confusion. We've many imperfections in the way we manage our environment, but we are doing things totally unimaginable not very long ago. We're starting to manage biodiversity across landscapes rather than just reserving a few bits here and there. Progressive farmers are developing grazing regimes that are profitable, better for conservation and suited to our climate and soils. We're trying to manage surface water and groundwater as if they're connected, which they are. Is it too slow and is it not enough? Probably. But I think assessed against ecological timescales, rather than the much shorter political ones or media cycles, what we're doing now will later be judged as profound in change. Desires for instant policy gratification are ill-advised. Now for the bridge too far, to shift from environment to politics and policy. We have noise and incomprehension today. It's in public debate. It's unfortunate, but I think it's understandable. The world we live in is complex, increasingly connected to all other parts, and very variable. And Australia has only been an open economy in a dynamic world for quite a short time, and many struggle with that. Laura Tingall's thesis in Great Expectations is that what Australians expect of governments reflects the past and the levers available then, not the world that we live in now. Our public discussions are not suited to mutual understanding and agreed visions of where we want to go or how to get there in a complex world. We have a new noisy environment, and it's of our own making. Much of what I would say about the state of political debate has already been said. Lindsay Tanner's book Sideshow and Malcolm Turnbull's recent speech, for example. But in 1988, Manning Clark commented on what had happened to dreams and visions of Australia. And I quote, "By 1987, all that seemed to survive was the Dutch Protestant dream of Australia as a place of uncommonly large profit. The vision of Eden had grown dim, mammon now infested the land, a turbulent emptiness had seized the people as they sat comfortless on Bondi Beach. No longer anyone knew the direction of the great river of life. No one had anything to say." But to capture current concern, I'll quote from an abstract of a speech a few weeks ago by Barry Jones. He was speaking, as I was, to the annual Australian Fire and Emergency Authorities Conference, and disturbingly, emergency management is now subject to dismal commentary that focuses on division, unevidenced opinion and blame laying by headline. There's some examples on the screen, courtesy of my colleague Michael Eburn, who collects them incessantly. Barry Jones said, "The challenge to address and resolve national priorities in politics, society and the environment has rarely been so important, but the community and media response has been the infantilisation of debate in which immediate and short-term issues have swamped any address to address long-term or global issues. Debates have been deformed by all sides, resorting to cherry-picking of evidence, denigration of opponents, mere sloganeering, leading to the infantilisation of democracy, treating citizens as if they are unable to grasp major issues. Opinion has misplaced evidence. Vested interest is more powerful than general interest. The media, old and new, is partly to blame. We can communicate rapidly, but in ways that are shallow and non-reflective. Advocacy and analysis has largely dropped out of politics, replaced by marketing and sloganeering. Politicians share the blame as consenting adults. Politics is now a sporting contest with violence, personality clashes, tribalism and quick outcomes." So that's what Barry Jones said. Is this too harsh? An infantile, deformed, shallow and non-reflective public debate defined by marketeering and sloganing. A show of hands? Jones describes the new noisy environment, and the noise is not musical or pleasant. Where Manning Clark saw that no one had anything to say, Barry Jones stated that there is no point raising serious issues months or years before an election. We've got a positive, this is a bit of a sort of quasi-science here, and I needed someone else to get it done for me. Thank you, Rob. We have a positive feedback loop between politics and the media. Politicians produce slogans and cheap arguments, and the media sells them on. These are mutually beneficial, reinforcing behaviours. It makes for easy media work with no need to investigate and analyse. Political leadership can become a matter of shouted slogans. It's actually a brilliant state of affairs, as neither side has to think too hard and the product gets bought, whether it's a headline or a vote. There are those who try to do better. Some politicians try to communicate the complexity of the world, but their words are soon twisted in the arena of media blood sport. Some in the media try as well, but it doesn't sell. They regret it even as they peddle the distasteful. They're caught in the positive feedback loop. Laura Tingle, in a recent quarterly essay, called this shouty politics, which rings true with Barry Jones's complaint and describes well this noisy environment. A torrent of uncritical, unconnected, unevidenced slogans is turning civil society into something less than civil and very confusing. In the latest quarterly essay, David Marr predicts this style of politics will become the norm and will continue. Now, while recently intensified, I believe it's been building over the last 2 to 3 decades. But blaming the media and politics is easy. Laura Tingle also considers the Australian public. They're the ones with great expectations of what government should do for them, even when those expectations may be mutually exclusive or dated or unthinking. While the positive feedback loop between politics and the media makes it hard for people to cut through the noise and understand complex issues, I don't believe ordinary citizens should be let off the hook. A sufficient number of Australians embrace spite, simplistic knee-jerk reactions and black and white opinions about important and complex issues. They too are consenting adults in the infantilisation of Australian public discussion. Look into the world of the tweet, talkback and blogosphere. We know and like the characteristics of we Australians. We're egalitarian and value a fair go. We're pleasantly provincial, not too cosmopolitan. We have a larrikin spirit that doesn't tolerate pomposity and encourages a healthy suspicion of authority. But those characteristics have been identified as buttons that don't have to be pushed too hard to produce a new set of national characteristics. The fair go becomes a carping resentment and suspicion of anyone who might get something you don't. Scepticism of authority becomes disbelief in our political and institutional system and produces rejection of expertise, where a shouted opinion is as good as strong evidence. Our endearing provincialism becomes a suspicion of the world and ignorance of global context and xenophobia. And those buttons have been expertly pushed by some in media, political and interest group circles to distort the Australian character. I am launching tonight a new newspaper. It comes out tomorrow morning. If understanding of and engagement with the political system and the world around us is what civics and a civil society is about, the opposite is an uncivil society, an uncivil Australia, A returning Australian recently encountered the headlines about how bad everything was and muttered that we were a pack of whinging, ungrateful, spoilt brats at the end of the world. That's what someone else said, not me. So the positive feedback loop actually has three components. Too many in the media, too many in politics, and too many in the Australian public either profit from, find convenient, or know nothing better than a willful ignoring of detail and context, one-sided simplistic arguments, and populism. And here it is again, formally. The three parts. That one word, populism, sums it up. A populist media loves populist politics, and together they produce infantile dross. And the buyers either love it or have little choice, whether the transaction is a newspaper, ratings for what passes as current affairs television, the rants of the shock jock, or voting in an election. And that diagram is a rather sad state of affairs. But two things are generally missing from this discussion: the state of public policy rather than politics, and what we might do about it. The critique is generally followed by a plea for better behaviour on the parts of politicians. Less often on the part of the media, and never on the part of the public. Those pleas are not helpful, as the positive feedback loop is just that, a reinforcing, convenient dependency. Politics is important, but its legacy is given substance by public policy, constructed within robust institutions. Good public policy lets us achieve social goals, reconcile differences, and seize opportunities. Politics points the direction. Public policy makes the journey happen. Good public policy is crucial to a good society, and it is hard, complex work. If public debate is unconstructive, then what's the condition of public policy in Australia? I believe our public institutions and policy capacities are sound. The size of the state is modest, despite popular myth. We are not highly taxed, again, despite popular myth, yet most Australians enjoy good conditions of life and good services. I said most. We have good, but I believe diminishing capacities to inform public policy through public organisations dedicated to gathering and analysing data. Corruption is low by international standards and the rule of law works. The federal system frustrates it, but it allows experimentation and checks and balances. But these achievements are threatened. Infected by adversarial politics and the instant gratification desires of the media, the public sector is becoming paranoid and inward-looking. It's harder to research, analyse, formulate and advise on good policy than it was in the past. And there's a problem of image. Australia has a low level of civic understanding. People are ignorant of how the system works, who does what and what to expect of it. And ignorance is the feedstock of populism. We've not really discussed the state of civic education in this country for almost 20 years. We've turned the notion of serving the public, being a public servant, into either an insult or a strong whiff of suspicion. We cannot have a useful public policy debate when too few understand the political and policy system. So I want to suggest some indicative reforms that might help. Recall the attributes of our environment and biota and how they work in a complex, interconnected world. These inform my suggestions. Sensitivity to variability in space and time and an aversion to simplistic strategies. Persistence and an eye to the long term. Not sacrificing all to a near-term calculus. Embracing diversity and collaboration by still being efficient and being very sensitive to information. I hope my suggestions are seen as viable, even if some of them may be whimsical or seen as unlikely in the near term. They are indicative and varied in kind to prompt discussion on what might be done, rather than simply complaining. We need to go deeper than just a call to clean up question time. Question time is theatre. We need to look to the policy and political processes to see where we can weaken the feedback loop and do some noise reduction. That's my theme, weaken that feedback loop and reduce the noise. My first suggestion is whimsical, but I think the problem's real. I would like to see a ban on negative, useless words in media and political debate. This could be an extremely long list which you'd all add to, so let's just start with some classics. Backflip, renege, cave-in, imbroglio, affair, and leadership tension. And two of my least favourite from Radio National, optics and atmospherics. What the hell does that mean? Now, we can't regulate this, but we could start with a rebellion of derision. The English language can be used to reduce the noise a little. But I think there's actually an innocent reason. The spell check function replaced the word inform with the word inflame in journalism training manuals. More seriously, another suggestion is for truth in labelling of individuals in media commentary. It is not informative when a private trader is labelled in an interview simply as economist. He may well be, or he might have done an economics degree many, many years ago. And it's not conducive to informed debate for an acclaimed scientist to be labelled an environmentalist. The viewer or listener cannot tell whether the commentator expounding policy opinion is from academia, industry, NGO or a think tank. Informed public discussion requires people to know the interest, standing and reputation of commentators. Which does prompt me to ask, why do so few academic economists engage in public commentary? Leaving the field to those, I believe, with less independence and likely less grasp of contemporary economics. The players are commentating the football game. And speaking of think tanks, public debate and actual policy is very often shaped by the reports or issues papers coming from think tanks, consultants and interest groups. These are accepted as being independent and of some quality. I suggest we need independent peer review of the quality of reports that deal with important policy issues. We academics are bound to anonymous expert peer review as quality assurance, an imperfect system, but better than anything else anyone has ever thought of. It is odd that think tanks and consultants can propose or cause a change in public policy and therefore in people's lives without such scrutiny. I've read some that aren't very good. Are the data, methods and conclusions of such reports robust and believable? Do they stack up against the standards of the relevant discipline? Peer review would weed out the dross, improve the standards and enhance trust in the policy changes that are proposed and debated. The noise could be sorted into the quality and the more questionable. For government commissioned reports, it would be a simple convention and there is a precedent in parts of the British public sector. Other organisations, think tanks and interest groups might follow, but to kick things off, I invite a research project to investigate and document the processes of quality assurance across the various organisations that put policy-oriented material out into the public domain and to publish the results of that study in a peer-reviewed journal, of course, and I would recommend the Australian Journal of Public Administration. How many people here read the Australian Journal of Public Administration? There are some of us here, Raymond, that's good. But more fundamentally, the art and craft of public policy and public administration needs to be better understood. This is rather self-serving coming from me, but I believe it's important. More disciplines and more people learn to learn a bit more about public policy. They might even find how utterly cool and interesting public policy is. There is too little appreciation of public policy amongst the public and media or in disciplines and professions that comment on policy issues. There's a poor understanding of the policy process, from the federal system and the parliamentary process down to the detail of policy implementation and public administration. There's poor understanding of the relative merits of different policy styles and instruments, the interplay between statute law and policy design and implementation, and the timing and impact of public policy measures. It is difficult to have a good public policy debate when the basic parameters of public policy are poorly known, and especially when commentators expect instant results. Consider the recent impatience over school funding. It's a classic example. Various commentators seem shocked, deeply shocked and annoyed that it might take a few months to negotiate a big, crucial, complex arrangement in a federal system. They wanted the answers that day. That deficit will be slow to reverse. I think a renewed discussion around civics education is certainly warranted in Australia. But more importantly, we do need a media that is more analytical, not carping and accusatory, but probing about the how and why of policy proposals or attacks on proposals. Demand evidence and put some rigour back into political journalism. Stop being lazy amplifiers of the flash and the noise and do your job. Make the noise more meaningful. But closer to home, I suggest the inclusion of public policy across disciplinary curricula could, over time, make a significant advance. Few university graduates will not interact with the public policy system, working in it, seeking to influence it, being influenced by it. My own experience of teaching policy to science students and their feedback and that of their employers later is that a single unit, or even less, is immeasurably better than nothing. Basic concepts, nomenclature and an idea of who does what is significantly better than having no idea at all. Public policy is not taught well in Australian universities. But at a higher level of the policy system, I have a bigger suggestion for a new parliamentary convention. Occasionally our political leaders attempt bipartisanship, usually over matters of defence and national security. Kevin Rudd offered this in Indigenous Affairs to an eventually dismissive opposition in 2007. And other, usually insincere, offers are occasionally made. A convention where selected issues are identified by bipartisan attention, for these to be subject to a different kind of debate during the term of the next parliament, whoever wins. Could we do 2 or 3 issues per term? The aim would be to properly inform and develop an agreed policy direction, policy mechanisms and funding, and stick with those for a decent period. This being done in a regular and visible fashion might, I say might, change the tone of politics. There is more bipartisanship in politics than most people know, but it is decreasing and it's largely invisible. Let's make it a feature. Taking 2 or 3 issues away from the blood sport would reduce the noise and contribute to the persistence, information sensitivity and longevity of our public policy. The discussion of which issues to choose would actually be a fascinating and worthwhile exercise in itself. There have been some obvious choices in recent years where debate would have been better for such a convention. Refugees, Indigenous affairs, climate change, research infrastructure and education come to mind. Conventions are not quickly invented, but slowly created and confirmed. So what could be the mechanism to create such a convention? Perhaps political leaders and parties will just do it, but I doubt it. It would need to be institutionalised in some way, and the parliamentary committee system is the obvious place. Some would find it strange to look to Parliament for hope, the very creature that's so often blamed for the myopia and noise. But Australia's parliamentary committee systems are one of the better features of our governance, where evidence, diverse views, bipartisanship and longer-term focus can often be found. Committees are sometimes a sideshow to the blood sport, but that's just when the media notices them, when they produce conflict. Often they do very good work. So, a standing committee to identify and propose issues suited to a non-partisan approach for the next parliament. It would create the agenda for the next parliament and work on the agenda for the current one. It would be a committee that members would like to be on. And interest groups would use the submission and hearing processes, I think, in a different and valuable way. We might see interest groups behave better when their concern is taken off the short-term battlefield and onto a careful, future-oriented deliberation. And the public service could do its rightful and finest work for such a committee. What a parliamentary spectacle for the media to seize on. Well-informed, civilised, non-partisan deliberation over long-term issues that are crucial to Australia's future, the shock jocks and tabloids would be devastated. But that suggestion invites thought as to other institutional and administrative measures that could inject flexibility, persistence and information sensitivity into policy debates. We have some that are world-class and are formally ranked as such as ABS. And we have some that one day might be, such as Infrastructure Australia. And once upon a time, Australia experimented with national-scale institutional mechanisms that were internationally remarkable and allowed an infirm view of long-term policy challenges. The Resource Assessment Commission, the Commission for the Future, Land and Water Australia, and the Bureau of Immigration and Population Research. Rest in peace, all 4 of them. I suggest we need to consider and have a good discussion around what institutional forms and processes we need now to understand and respond to emerging future challenges. And I note the Productivity Commission recommendation for something like Land and Water Australia again, but with a widened scope and much more funding. But then I would say that. For a long-term informed approach to national challenges, the review, evaluation and adaptation of policy programs is absolutely key. And in my view, we are rather poor at that. Programs are not well monitored, evaluation is poorly done late, and when done, often swerves between being secretive and paranoid or part of the bipartisan noise, There are excellent exceptions, such as the biennial assessment program under the National Water Initiative, but overall, the situation is grim. It is absolutely astonishing that we had to wait till last week for a private report to assess the energy efficiency impact of the National Insulation Program. That program that may never be named. Monitoring and public reporting of such schemes should be regular practice. The report was positive, by the way, so much of the media ignored it. Why we don't evaluate and renew programs well, accusatory politics, rebadging of programs and lack of capacity are part of the problem, but so is the short-term nature of the policy process. But I think the limits of forward estimates and the way we construct national framework policies are much more interesting challenges than the usual problem identified of budget and electoral cycles. And I think we're overdue for a hard look at ways to allow commitments on agreed priorities outside the limits of forward estimates. We have areas of critical need for long-term focus that are currently ad hoc and amnesiac, such as long-term environmental monitoring and long-term tracking of the performance of our urban systems. But on making national framework policies more long-term and purposeful, it's very unfashionable to look to Europe for inspiration these days for some reason. But I find the rolling target setting and review cycles of major policy directives in the EU a very interesting case. We need to give national framework policies greater longevity while retaining flexibility. And that's hard to do amidst the noise, but if we did it, it might reduce the noise a bit. My final suggestion is impractical, but it targets the appalling lack of appreciation of the global context that too many media commentators, members of the public and some politicians have of Australia. The glass is not half full or half empty, it varies. Sometimes it's quite empty, such as on disadvantage in parts of our community. But on some global indicators, the glass is actually damn close to overflowing. Where else but in Australia would the headline, "Melbourne beats Sydney in global ranking," occur, rather than celebrating the fact that 4 of the 10 cities ranked most livable in the world were Australian? Or an overall strong result in university rankings for Australia turned into a negative headline about a small slip down by one university who shall remain nameless. We think everything's bad. A pack of ungrateful, whinging, spoilt brats at the end of the world, as someone else said. I invite someone to produce an Australian compared summary for general consumption every year, capture who we are relative to the rest of the world, energy use, income, education, health, disadvantage, population, employment and the rest. Put it on the web, put it in every letterbox, the good and bad numbers. Give people the means to interpret the noise. Make it apparent that we do not actually have the highest refugee intake in the known history of the universe. That we in fact have quite good education standards on most global rankings. We're not highly taxed. The state is not bigger than the Australian continent and all the rest. In whose interest could that not be? Ignorance is the feedstock of populism. I'll finish up now. It's a pity that public policy is seen as dry and boring by many people. When extracting that earlier quote from Manning Clark, I found another quote of his, which I'll read in a moment. But recall his words about a loss of vision, about mammon infesting the country and about no one having anything to say. I hope we can do better than that. But then I'm a social scientist and I think public policy is cool. Manning said, "Social scientists seem to me to be dry souls, men and women through whom the gale of life did not blow very high. They often spoke and wrote as though it were desirable to apply the principles and methods of the bookkeeper to the subject of human happiness. Social scientists, it seemed to me, were among the spiritual bullies of the 20th century. In some of their works, it was not easy to tell whether they were writing about people or about sheep or about cattle. The discipline of public policy is a social science, so is political science. Public policy is the arena of social scientists. I hope Clark's gale of life can blow a little higher through the theory and practice of public policy in Australia. And I call on others not just to bemoan the decline of public debate, but to think about mechanisms that could serve to correct the trend. I've offered a few possibilities to start that debate. We need more aimed at weakening the positive feedback loop that has such negative results and reducing the noise a bit. And on reflection, I'd rather be a social scientist than an anti-social scientist. Thank you. And I get to run my own Q&A session. The only warning is that the people behind the light there will probably need to wave their hand quite a lot, and there's a mic. So, anti-social scientists, let rip.
I was just wondering that one of the efforts to sort of break that feedback loop, or clear one that I sort of reflected on as you were talking, was about making the RBA independent in terms of how it sets interest rate policy. And I was wondering first if you think that's a good way to go in terms of other areas of public policy, and if so, to what problems or issues?
Yeah, there are both, if you like, instrumental and political reasons for having an independent RBA. The instrumental reason is that you have reasoned judgment rather than flips. The political reason is that you don't have political choices done in that way. I think in terms of the institutional forms we need, I believe that we have forgotten the value of the statutory authority. Over a number of years, we have made less independent many things in public administration. And some of that was done for understandable reasons, because we had sclerotic statutory authorities in some sectors. But I don't believe that our response to that problem, which may have been good reform but keeping that level of independence, needed to go as far as it did, or was fairly unthinking and often within poor statutory or regulatory frameworks of corporatised agencies. So I think it is an interesting model. It is interesting to think about those bodies that do not get caught up in the partisan noise. And the Australian Bureau of Statistics is actually a fascinating one, and often judged internationally in the top very few in the world. So there are cases where we can create those sorts of informing institutions which are able to operate behind the political noise or away from it. Unfortunately, we've done some, and I mentioned some, such as the Resource Assessment Commission and so on, that, I mean, 3.5 years isn't a long time to prove your worth before you're shut down. So giving things time and reforming them in a sensible way rather than the flip-flopping that we do tend to do would probably be a way to go. Let me guess, this could be a question about Europe.
Very wrong, Steve.
I put that bit specially in for you.
Yeah, that comes later. But let me first ask another one, which concerns your feedback loop. How do you see the role of the social media in this public policy process, in particular in relation politics and media? How do you see this influencing the model you described?
I should confess that my face is not in a book, and I'm not a twit. Did I get that right? Social media is fascinating, but I'd lump it more with, ITC generally, because social media is one thing, but there's all forms of others, and there are positives and negatives. It is marvellous for all sorts of ways for interest groups to be able to share and discover information. Some of our best media is now web-based, and some of it has been started as a direct consequence of us not being able to publish decent stories in their own newspapers, so they do it online. The negatives are, I think, as Barry Jones put it, a very non-reflective, instantaneous capacity. So I think that is going to pan out over the next few years. I believe some people are going to leave social media because of its banality. Some people will start to use it, hopefully in a more informed, responsive way. But I don't think we know where that's going yet. And honestly, politicians don't do good Facebook and tweet, do they? It is awkward, just don't do it. Actually, I did look at Facebook once.
Thank you, Stephen. As you know, I'm a doctoral student here at ANU looking at sustainability policy, and as part of the policy of the College of Arts and Sciences in which I'm based, I'm doing an elective course at the moment in public policy in the Crawford School. And I've been a little confronted by the approach used. One of the aims of our class is to produce the yesable proposition. And this is to be produced for the client, who may be your boss, who demands an answer by 5 p.m. that day or by Friday. So I think the boss is really confronted by the marketing and news cycles as well. It filters down to all kinds of levels. But just to follow on from that, I want to say the peer review idea, I think it's excellent. It definitely is needed in this current formula, therefore. But to follow on from the fact that I'm in the College of Arts and Social Sciences, I wanted to ask you, given that policy is an area of social science, fundamentally, what do you think the humanities or the arts can offer policy making?
A gale of life that blows higher through people. Actually, people probably need to think of that quote of Manning Clark's in the context of the sort of social science that appeared in the 50s, 60s and the fights that people from the humanities had with them. A couple of comments. Actually, the 24-hour news cycle is a fundamental problem of modern policy making and political debate. It drives the desire for instant gratification in every answer, all of that. And it makes the life of the people in the public service impossible in that you cannot actually have time to reflect, to do research, to analyse. On the humanities, I do believe that the humanities offer quite a lot. Values would be one. Not that social sciences don't have values, but I believe that a lot of public policy teaching is free of values. I think public policy is best taught. Public policy is a sort of a diverse discipline, so you can arrive at more legalistic or more economic or more political science views or more administrative views. It needs to be taught in a broad way, and I wouldn't limit the input to the relevant social sciences and some humanities, but I believe the natural sciences have a role too, given that many of the major public policy debates we have incorporate a large amount of concern over natural systems or over engineered systems. So it should be a much broader church than I believe it is now. There was some work done by a colleague, Kate Sherrin, a few years ago, where Australia, people from Queanbeyan, they just can't be trusted. Where Australia's environmental studies, environmental science curricula was analysed to look at the disciplinary coverage in that interdisciplinary domain. And a matching survey was done of people to say, if you taught people interdisciplinary about sustainability, managing the world we live in, what would have to be in there? And the biggest gap between what people thought was absolutely essential and what was not there was public policy. And I would be interested to see that in a few other areas. I occasionally give short courses to people from the bureaucracy and I say, look, this is ridiculous. You do it for a living and here I'm from the university in Canberra and I'm here to help you. And they go, no, but we never learnt this. But it should be a very multidisciplinary discourse around public policy. It's too important not to be. Actually, just before, we could probably just break down the threefold: natural sciences, social sciences, humanities. We could call them the inhumanities, the anti-social sciences, and the unnatural sciences. But really, they do tend to merge, and increasingly people work at the interstices of those divisions.
Idris Lehman from computer science, but interested in public policy. Just wanted to ask your opinion about the role of universities in emulating public policy scenarios. Like so physical sciences, I think there's a lot of examples of using university itself as a living laboratory of how you can demonstrate concepts. Can you see examples of similar nature in public policy? I'm thinking in the US and Canada, they have a group of universities who are doing carbon trading and carbon reporting together, and that seems to be like a very good example when you have an overwhelming public policy that's still not moving far in that area. Thank you.
I think universities have a role and a privilege and I think a duty to lead from outside the constraints that operate under for other groups active or other institutional forms active in the debate. The problem with living laboratories, it's dreadful being a social scientist. I wish I was still an ecologist because you're not allowed to experiment on humans. But my comments about the longer term monitoring and evaluation of policy interventions is, I think, partially answer to that. We do experiments all the time. We roll out policy interventions and then we walk away. Policy ad hocery and amnesia. But the idea of adaptive management, which has come from ecology, has evolved to the idea of adaptive governance. Adaptive policy is what good public policy should be, that you accept, that you make a satisfied choice of what should work with reasonable evidence, but you certainly do the routine data capture and the ongoing work on it. That is very hard when policy programs are mostly fairly short term. So hence my suggestions for ways to break out of the shorter term cycle. We have living laboratories everywhere. Every policy intervention which is aimed at changing human behaviour is an experiment. And in a strictly scientific sense, we fail to actually carry through with those experiments. But universities, as suburbs-sized institutions, have quite a lot of potential to do work in that regard, and a number of things at ANU do that as we start to set up our solar monitoring, a campus management, environmental management plan that just won an award. So there, Vice-Chancellor, I have congratulated our university on its achievements. But our universities, I think, not just have a role to lead, but probably have a, not an activist role, but certainly an expectation that they should be able to manage their own affairs as well as they seem to think that the rest of the world should manage theirs.
Jason Alexandra, Murray-Darling Basin Authority, former Director of Land and Water Australia. I wanted to pick up the...
you liked that one, didn't you?
The rest in peace for 4 independent agencies, and I think it might have been the first question about we're clearly not using those kind of independent institutions in Australia. And this last question, the role of universities, and it seems to me that it's worth asking why they were short-lived but productive and highly acclaimed and then shut down. And secondly, what do you see the potential for universities to step into the breach and become more active participants in policy development, policy criticism, and then do they also run the risk of the wrath of governments for being the irritants in the policy process?
I do have this slight unease about my professional career that agencies that I got closely involved in and accepted funding from and helped all got shut down. Why they got shut down? The RAC, I think there's a good documented history of that. It was given a brief that it should never have been given, Coronation Hill. It was given something that mattered importantly in the public arena and would annoy half the country no matter what it did. The Bureau of Immigration, Population and Multicultural Research, I would go so far as to say, got shut down in a sweep of shutting things down, but the word multicultural in its name did not help at that particular point in time. LWA, that's too complex a story, because I think it's a far more complex story than most people think. The fact that its staff were not on standard appointments and didn't require redundancy payments actually had a fair bit to do with it. Universities, yeah, will get shut down. I think there's actually, and I think ANU's increasingly structured interactions with the Commonwealth and with the APS is the sort of arrangement that should be mutually beneficial, non-threatening, and will involve some adjustment of behaviour on each side. What worries me, because I work as much with state and local government, I'd like to see those sorts of structured partnerships spread. We need the APS needs us, but the state and territories certainly need some assistance. And local government, that poor cousin of Australian governance, the Commonwealth has the money, the states have the power, and local government get the problems, is an area of public policy and public administration in Australia that is pretty much universally ignored by scholarship, research, and poorly understood by both federal and state governments.
Steve, I studied economics here at the ANU 20 years ago.
Have you recovered?
Just wondering whether you think, whether you have a sense of whether the teaching of economics has improved.
Implicit in your question is some judgment of... I'm actually not familiar enough. I would say that I have proposed a open-to-all course at ANU called Understanding Contemporary Economic Debates. Some people I suggested that to, of course, said you'd have to do macro and micro before you did that. And I said, yeah, no, you know, to understand the history of economic thought, I received a blank look at that point. Economics has narrowed as a discipline. Although it's a huge discipline, there are some interesting interdisciplines attached, institutional economics, ecological economics, and so on. I think it should be taught broader and with a sense of its own history and its role in society. It wasn't 20 years ago?
Steve, do you think compulsory voting has a detrimental effect on public policy? And do you think if we adopted optional voting, that would raise the tone of public debate and politics?
I was forced to vote in Queanbeyan the other day, so it's compulsory even for local. I actually, on balance, am strongly supportive of compulsory voting. It does exacerbate populism in that it has a proportion of the population who are not particularly involved, engaged or knowledgeable, but who vote and are subject to the sorts of shock ads we get around election time. But the alternative is for governments that lack legitimacy in some sense, and also for the mobilisation of particular interest groups. When only 50% or 60% vote, the ability for a well-organised, well-funded, perhaps highly emotive interest group to make a larger impact, which washes out when you have compulsory voting. Very often the unengaged voter opts for something roughly in the middle. So on balance, I would disagree with Americans and say that voting in a democracy is not just a right, it's also a responsibility. But we certainly need better civics education so that people do that. Was it 1984-87 when Janine Haynes proposed, only Janine Haynes as a leader of a political party would propose that Australians should have to sit a test and get a licence before they vote? I think she was returned with the highest vote after that election.
Thanks, Steve. My name's Richard Baker. I'm the Director of Science Education, and probably more importantly, I've been a very close colleague of Steve's for 20 years, and he's taught into many of my courses, an environmental policy and planning course that he still runs with Karen Hussey, I can see there, and two of the Vice-Chancellor's courses that I've run. It's great to see so many people who've done those courses here tonight. It's my great pleasure tonight to offer the vote of thanks to Steve. Drinks await us. I'll be very, very brief. But I think we should recognise what a great role Steve has played for a long time in this area. And his talk tonight, I think, has kept up his very high standard and everything he's written and spoken about Australia's environment, what's distinctive about Australia's environment, and the challenges we have to have a similar cultural and social environment which is distinctive and as clever as our country. I love that idea of Australia having to be socially as clever as our landscape is, which is turning a phrase on its head, which is one of Steve's great skills, is his wordsmith skills. In lectures to my course and in publications for years, he's been talking about policy, ad hocery and amnesia, which is such a wonderful phrase. Here's another one which he didn't use tonight, which I think is very pertinent to what he said, which is we are still settling Australia. Is anything settled? And I think it's quite a profound question, which I think comes from that book that he quoted, the Eric Rolls work earlier. So Steve was also very modest in terms of his contribution. A lot of the work he quoted were from publications that he's put together and edited, and he's been a profoundly important figure in environmental history and environmental policy. And I'd like just to finish with a few reflections on how Steve exemplifies something really important, a few things really important about ANU. And the first is his interdisciplinary thinking, which is something that ANU is very good at. I think it's something to do with our small size. Students get it. We have the highest proportions of students doing double degrees, and they're working across those in very imaginative ways. Steve's from the Fenner School, which has a charter to integrate, I've forgotten the three phrases you used, or the three different ways of looking at knowledge, but Western thought has done a great job at chopping up knowledge in different areas, and the Fenner School is trying to integrate our understandings of the environment and society. And that's a very, very important thing, obviously, in terms of the issues Steve has put in place to us tonight. The ANU strategic plan released last year and developed by the Vice-Chancellor talks about public policy being an important comparative advantage and future imperative for ANU to work on. And again, Steve exemplifies that, and it's something in my new role as Director of Science Education, I'm very keen for science students in general to be exposed more to public policy issues. They are through the environmental policy course that I taught for 15 years, and now Steve's taking it on. But I think it's something that all science students, and indeed all ANU students, need to be exposed to. I was looking at the data of where science students go, and 60% of last year's graduates who've got jobs are working in the public sphere, and by far the biggest number in the federal public service. And I think we're letting them down, and students do give us that feedback, and not doing them enough to prepare them for some quite different situations, perhaps through being a lab chemist or a lab scientist in any field. And the last thing that I think Steve really does exemplify is something that, again, the Vice-Chancellor's strategic plan stresses, which is the research-led nature of the entire ANU experience, but it's something very profoundly significant and inspiring for students, having Australia's leading researchers like Steve coming into the classroom. So long before Steve was in a department that combined teaching and research, he always said yes when I asked him to come and give a lecture to my courses. And that bringing current research into the classroom is something that's really significant about ANU. And I think Steve's work challenged the students, but I also can see some ways where the students challenged Steve. So the expression of policy being incredibly cool is a long way from how Steve expressed policy to students 18, 17 years ago. So I think there is an interaction that happens in the classroom which is really important for great researchers. I was reading a biography of Thomas Kuhn at the weekend and talked about his work on scientific revolutions only happened because he had to teach a general course on the history of science. He was a physicist beaving away, and then he said that his great change happened when he got into the classroom. So this research-ledness is something that Steve exemplifies, and something that's very important about ANU. And again, I think it's something we need to build on with people like Steve. So just before I suggest we go outside and have drinks, and Steve, I think, will be prepared to answer more questions there. Can you join me in thanking Steve again?